It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about having control over our devices, our technology, our phones, and a 21-day challenge is TJ Burdick. Thanks for being here, TJ.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. I appreciate it.
Now, how often do you use technology in your everyday life? Would you consider yourself to be attached to your technology?
I would actually use the proper word. I use the word technophile. Actually, I'm on my phone almost all the time, unfortunately. With my own work, both, on online marketing and things that I do online, I'm attached to a screen almost all day, and it's not a good thing. So I would consider myself on the higher end of screen usage.
Yeah. You actually said you were a former tech addict. Would you classify this as a real addiction?
Yes, I would. In fact, a lot of psychologists nowadays would consider activities such as when you're on your screens too much as, tech addiction. Tech addiction comes in many forms, and I think the problem with today's culture, ever since the dawn of the smartphone about a decade ago, is that a lot of people have kind of let technology creep into their lives in a way that is unhealthy at best and addictive at worst. And so we have a lot of people who, when you forget your phone at home and you go about the rest of your day, and you kind of feel that sense of not being connected, what most psychologists would call nomophobia. These little things that kind of creep into our lives that kind of make us aware of just how much technology influences our life, which it can for the better, but it can also for the worse.
What was the phobia called?
Nomophobia. It actually comes from no mobile phobia. So they put the two together and call it nomophobia.
Wow. How long do you think it's been since that really was an issue?
Well, that's a good question. I think once computers really started hitting back in the late 90s and early 2000s, that's when most people started kind of feeling that itch. When it became really social, I think, was when it became more of a issue. When we had AIM, Instant Messenger, we had ways to connect with people that we weren't able to do so prior to, technology revolution. And I think since technology is continuing to advance so quickly, we find ourselves more easily capable of being distracted by our technology as opposed to using it for its primary purpose of, making our lives more efficient and more productive, and what I would argue to be actually even more spiritual.
Now, with things like alcoholism and some other addictions, we know that there's some kind of traits that some people are more prone to be addicts than others, and maybe it's even genetic. Is that the same with technology? Are some people more prone to be addicted to their technology?
I think there are a lot more people who are prone to be addicted to technology for the very reason that it has become socially acceptable. I mean, when you struggle with substance abuse, you talked about their signs. You can see when people are becoming to be affected negatively because of their addiction to substance abuse. They, have physical tics. They have these, intense desires to satisfy their cravings for a physical entity, whether it be alcohol or whether it be drugs. And so you see their lives being affected negatively almost immediately due to their addiction, in which they are removing themselves from relationships. They are withdrawn. They are suffering physically. And the difference between a substance abuse victim and somebody who would be addicted to their phone or addicted to the technology is that it's a behavioral addiction. And behavioral addictions are much easier to hide because it's not necessarily something that's noticeable. Yes, you can see people on their phones, but what exactly are they doing on their phones? You never quite know. And they can also close themselves off in their room, and the effects aren't necessarily noticeable in a physical sense, but yet they do tend to manifest themselves in much the same way that substance abuse victims do, in that they do withdraw from people. They do end up finding ways to ignore their responsibilities as human beings to love one another, to serve others, to actually complete their work. And obviously there are some side effects that you can see, but not as many, just because it is, not only is it a behavioral addiction, but it's become so culturally acceptable to be on your phone at all times that most people ignore those types of signs, and they kind of follow the current of technology addiction.
So since it is so accepted and it is so normalized in our society, and I think people can easily justify their phone use. Like, oh, I'm staying in touch with friends, or this is how I can know what my family's up to, or I'm getting work done. How do we know if we are addicted?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in numbers, and I think we severely underestimate how much time we're actually on our phones and on our technology. And so the first thing I always recommend is just, if you want to see a good indicator, a good litmus test, if you will, of whether or not you are addicted to your technology, is to really time yourself. You can download monitoring apps. You can figure out how much time you're on your phone, on your screen. And taking a look at that number at the end of the day really gives you a good estimate of just about how much your life is dedicated to using technology. From my research in the book that I wrote, which is called Detached, Put Your Phone in Its Place, I've discovered that the average adult, obviously this ranges, but the younger you are, the more it is, but the average adult spends about 3.5 hours on their phone every day. And the vast majority of what they're doing online isn't necessarily for their own efficiency or production or, living life in their order, or, as you said earlier, catching up with their friends or talking with family, which I would consider a good use of technology. But the vast majority of them admit to, and this is a high percentage, I'm saying like 76, 78% of them say that when they're on their phone, the vast majority of the time, they're basically wasting time. They're scrolling on social media. They're not doing anything particularly productive. Maybe they're playing a game or doing something that has really little to no value to add to their day. And so that's when I realized that, you know what? It's true. When I downloaded my monitoring app for the first time, I totally underestimated myself. I thought I was on my phone for maybe like 40 minutes a day. Within 3 hours of downloading my monitoring app, I had already been on my phone for 2.5 of those hours. And I couldn't believe it. I was just like, this is amazing. And it stealthily comes into your life and you don't even realize it. And I think that it's a big problem with our world because it's causing us to be less productive. We're having less connections with our relationships, and ultimately we're becoming less spiritually active because of it.
I want to talk about that spiritual piece. We're talking with TJ Burdick. The book is Detached, Put Your Phone in Its Place, and it's a 21-day challenge, which I also want to share how that's going to work. But first, how does it affect us spiritually, our use and potential addiction to technology?
Well, if you've ever read the Screwtape Letters, I dedicate a chapter of this in my book. Uncle Screwtape is a senior demon, and he's trying to teach his nephew, which is named Wormwood, a junior demon, if you will, to convince a human to obviously go against God and to end up, in hell. And so I think when you think about that type of a story, and you think about all the different temptations that we have, the devil works in subtle ways. He doesn't try to convince people to murder people on the very first bat. He doesn't commit to people to rob. He doesn't go for the serious sins. He works in subtle ways. And one of the most subtle ways that he creeps into our lives is through distractions, whether it be distractions from prayer, whether it be distractions from going to church or doing the right thing or serving the poor. There's always something that comes up that says, oh, I can do this later, or I can do this in a different time, or maybe I just won't do it at all. And I think the number one distractor in our world today is our phones, because every time we're bored, every time we have a moment to ourselves, those are moments when they can be huge encounters with God. We can be really deeply spiritually moved during those times of just nothingness, just being. And yet, every time that happens, we tend to take out our phones and replace it with something that is less valuable for our lives. And so, yes, there's a lot of times when we feel this urge to just grab our phones and grab our technology and fill that boredom, when in reality, we need that boredom to become spiritually alive. That's where God talks to us in the secret of our heart in those times of silence, contemplative prayer, and truthfully, boredom.
So your 21-day challenge, this isn't just go 21 days without touching any kind of technology. What are you challenging us to?
Right, yeah, that would be, I think it's almost impossible to go without technology nowadays. I mean,
Isn't that crazy?
Everyone needs an email address to even apply for a job at work. So I mean,
Right.
we're already ingrained with it. We do need technology to a certain extent. You could argue that we don't need technology, and yes, we could, go off the grid and plant our own crops and do all these other things that we want to do. But that's not realistic for everybody.
Sure.
And so what I discovered is that, in my own life, that technology can be super useful. And it's using it as a tool to help benefit your life that is the challenge for a lot of people. I think we get so distracted with it that we just continue to use it, without even knowing how much it's affecting us. So the reason I wrote this book in this way was that so you didn't necessarily have to divorce yourself from your technology. Rather, you could use it for the tool it was meant to be. And not only that, but to be able to use it for your life sufficiency, for your productivity, but more importantly, to use it as a spiritual tool that will guide you closer in your relationship with God. And so that's the reason of the 21-day retreat, is because I realize even on my own accord, if I were to go 21 days without my phone, I'd come back to 50 million emails, and then I would have to backtrack and do all this extra work. It would take me probably 3 months to make up from the 21 days that I was off my phone.
Right.
And so that's not a good situation for anybody. And so the whole idea of this book is to take a retreat from the negative things that your phone is causing you to do. Take a retreat from all the time wasting that you're doing on your phone, and then prioritize your life to a point that you can be the handler of your technology. You be the one that dictates what you do, and you don't let your phone dictate what you're supposed to do based on the behavioral addiction patterns that you may or may not be having.
So practically, what does it look like from day to day in this? Because each day you have a different chapter to work through. So what does that look like?
Yeah, well, every day there's obviously a spiritual reflection. There's a specific point that I make in each chapter that points to sometimes your priorities, sometimes it's what are the distractors in your life, what are the hooks, the things that kind of get you online all the time, and then trying to figure out ways to take those negatives and turn them into positives. So there are some times where there are things that you have to do. Sometimes there are just things that you have to think about. But the vast majority of the book it's a process that kind of takes you up a spiritual ladder, if you will, so that you can attain freedom from your technology device, so that you can actually contemplate more and become more in union with God and His church.
Did you actually go through this process then after putting together the book, or in the process of putting together the book?
That was the hardest part, was because I was coming out of the whole technology addiction stage, and I was realizing how incredibly hard it was to put my own words into practice. And so as I was writing every chapter, I was realizing I was challenging myself to live out a life of, when you think about the saints, they lived virtue to a heroic degree. And I think in this day and age, we're the first saints of the digital age. And so here's this object that we have that can be one of the main tools of our sanctification, the very thing that will make us saintly and holy. And its power is unmatched by anything prior to it. So here I am trying to write this book and trying to live that life, and it was hard.
Yeah.
It still is hard every time I try to do this at retreat.
All right. Again, it's called Detached. Put your phone in its place. TJ Burdick is the author, and you can check it out at detachedlife.com or Our Sunday Visitor or wherever you get books. Thank you so much, TJ, for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it.